If you're hungry, pick it up from the floor. My son-in-law said that while my dinner was still sliding across the hardwood in front of my entire family. The mashed potatoes hit my shoes first, then the gravy. I remember staring at the piece of roast beef near the leg of my chair while nobody at that table moved a single inch to help me. Not my daughter, not my wife, not even my own grandson. Daniel leaned back in his chair with this little smile on his face, like humiliating a 74-year-old man was somehow funny. Then he laughed and said, "Come on, Frank. Don't act like a victim." I heard my daughter Emily whisper, "Dad, please don't start tonight." That hurt more than the food on the floor. Because in that moment, I realized something I should have seen a long time ago. I wasn't a father in that house anymore. I was just an old man everybody tolerated until I became inconvenient. Before I continue, if this story truly resonates with you, maybe take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if stories like this speak to your heart. And I'd really love to know where you're watching from tonight, your city or country, and what time it is there right now. My name is Frank Whitmore. I'm 74 years old, and the dinner you're about to hear about was the night my family stopped pretending they respected me. Funny thing is, they had no idea who I really was anymore. It started about 6 months earlier after Emily and Daniel moved into my property outside Asheville, North Carolina. Technically, it was supposed to be temporary. Daniel lost money on some investment opportunity he kept calling a short-term setback, and Emily asked if they could stay in the guest house behind my home for a few months while they got back on their feet. I said yes because that's what fathers do. At first, things were normal. Daniel shook my hand every morning, called me sir, helped me carry groceries. Then little things started changing. He began parking his black Silverado in my garage instead of outside. He started introducing the place as our property whenever his friends came over for cookouts. One afternoon, I heard him telling a neighbor, "Once the paperwork clears, we're probably going to renovate the whole place." I remember looking up from my newspaper thinking, paperwork for what? But when I asked Emily about it later, she just sighed and said, "Dad, Daniel's trying to build something for our future. You always assumed the worst about him." That caught me off guard because I hadn't accused anybody of anything. I just asked a question. After that, I noticed Emily slowly changing too. She stopped sitting with me on the porch in the evenings. Stopped asking about my doctor appointments. Half the time when I talked, she looked distracted, like she was waiting for me to finish. And Daniel, well, Daniel got comfortable. Too comfortable. He started making little jokes during dinner. "Careful, Frank, don't break a hip getting up." Or, "You already tell this story today, old man." Everybody would laugh awkwardly while I smiled and let it go. That's the thing about getting older. People mistake patience for weakness. A few weeks later, I walked into my own kitchen one morning and found Daniel sitting at the table with a stack of papers spread out beside his coffee mug. He covered them the second he saw me. Too fast. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I answered. Then I noticed my name printed at the top of one page before he flipped it over. Whitmore Holdings, LLC. My company. The company I spent 42 years building from one pickup truck and a borrowed toolbox. I asked him why he had my business documents. He smiled without looking nervous at all and said, "Emily thought it'd be smart if I started helping organize things around here." Around here? I didn't respond right away. I just stood there listening to the coffee machine hum while something cold settled in my stomach. Because there was only one place those documents were locked away. And only 3 people in the family knew the combination to that safe. I did not sleep much that night after seeing those documents in Daniel's hands. I sat alone on the back porch until almost 2 in the morning listening to the cicadas and staring at the workshop behind the house. That workshop used to be my favorite place in the world. Emily practically grew up in there with me. When she was 7 years old, she used to sit on an upside-down paint bucket while I worked on cabinets and shelves for clients all over Buncombe County. I can still hear her little voice asking, "Daddy, why do you sand the wood so long?" And I would tell her, "Because if you rush important things, sweetheart, they fall apart later." Back then she thought I could fix anything. Scraped knees, broken bicycles, nightmares during thunderstorms. Her mother worked double shifts at the hospital when Emily was little, so most nights it was just the 2 of us eating grilled cheese sandwiches at the kitchen counter while old country songs played on the radio. I still remember carrying her into the house asleep in my arms after 4th of July fireworks when she was 10 years old. She wrapped her tiny hand around my neck and whispered, You will always take care of me, right, Daddy? I told her yes without even thinking about it. That is what fathers do. The problem is nobody tells you that one day your child grows up and starts believing somebody else's version of you. Emily met Daniel when she was 32. He came into the family loud, confident, always talking like he was the smartest man in every room. At first I tried to like him. Honestly, I did. He wore expensive boots, drove polished trucks, and shook hands too hard like he was trying to win something. During our first Thanksgiving together, he looked around my dining room and said, "This house has good bones, Frank. With the right upgrades, this place could be worth serious money." I laughed politely and told him the house was not going anywhere. He smiled at me and said, "Everything changes eventually." I should have paid more attention to that sentence. Over the years, I noticed little things Emily stopped telling me. Bills, arguments, money problems. She used to call me every Sunday morning just to talk. Then the calls turned into quick texts. Then silence unless she needed something. One Christmas about 3 years ago, I gave her the old silver bracelet her mother wore when we were first married. Emily opened the box, smiled for maybe 2 seconds. Then Daniel looked over and said, "You know what would really help us? Instead of antiques? A down payment." He laughed after saying it, but nobody else did. I remember my wife Patricia quietly saying, "Daniel does not mean anything by those jokes." But he always did. That was the thing about him. Every insult came wrapped inside a smile. A few days after I caught him with those business papers, I decided to check the safe in my office while everyone was out shopping in town. Nothing looked disturbed at first. The envelopes were stacked neatly. The property deeds were still there. The trust documents too. But then I noticed one folder slightly out of place. Just barely crooked compared to the others. Most people would never notice something like that. But I built that office myself 23 years ago. I know every inch of it. I opened the folder and immediately felt my stomach tighten. Somebody had made photocopies of several signature pages connected to Whitmore Holdings. Not the originals. Copies. But enough to study. Enough to practice. I stood there for a long time staring at those papers while the grandfather clock downstairs ticked through the silence. Then I heard Daniel's truck pulling into the driveway earlier than expected, and for the first time in years, I realized my own family might already be planning something behind my back. The strange thing is, none of this started with screaming or threats. It started with people suddenly treating me differently the moment they realized I still had something they wanted. About 2 weeks after I found those photocopies, I got a call from a man named Richard Hale out of Charlotte. Richard used to work for one of the largest commercial developers in western North Carolina, and years ago I helped him when his business nearly collapsed after a bad partnership. We had not spoken in almost a decade. He said, "Frank, I heard you are still consulting privately once in a while." I laughed and told him, "Not much these days." Then he said something that caught me off guard. "Well, I have a project up in Hendersonville. 12 luxury cabins on 80 acres. And honestly, the only reason I am calling is because people still trust your name around here." I did not know what to say for a second. At 74 years old, most people stop looking at you like you still matter. They start speaking slower around you, repeating things, smiling politely while ignoring half of what you say. But Richard talked to me like the old version of Frank Whitmore still existed. 2 days later, I drove out to the property with him. Fresh mountain air, pine trees everywhere. The kind of land I used to dream about developing 30 years ago. Richard handed me a folder and said, "I want you overseeing the project. Part-time. Whatever hours you want." I remember standing there staring across those hills thinking maybe my life was not finished after all. Maybe I still had something left to build. When I got home that evening, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone while Emily cooked spaghetti. I told them about the offer. Emily smiled at first. "Dad, that is actually amazing." But Daniel did not look up from his screen. He just said, "You are 74, Frank." I shrugged. And he finally looked at me and laughed a little. "You seriously think you should be managing construction sites at your age?" Emily quietly said, "Daniel," but he kept going. "I am just being realistic. You should be relaxing, not climbing around job sites with a bunch of contractors." I told him it was consulting work, not roofing houses in July heat. But the look on his face bothered me. It was not concern. It was irritation, like my future was interfering with something he had already planned. After dinner, Emily followed me onto the porch while I watered the tomato plants beside the railing. She crossed her arms and said, "Dad, Do not take this personally, but maybe Daniel is right about slowing down. I looked at her for a moment and asked, You really think I am too old to make my own decisions? She sighed immediately. That is not what I said. Feels like it. She rubbed her forehead the way her mother does when she is stressed. Daniel just worries about stability. Stability. Funny word considering he had burned through most of his savings trying to impress people who never respected him to begin with. A few nights later, I woke up around 1 in the morning because I heard voices downstairs. At first I thought the television was on, but then I recognized Daniel's voice coming from the kitchen. I stayed near the top of the staircase where they could not see me. Daniel was whispering harshly. We cannot keep waiting forever, Emily. She sounded nervous. He is still healthy. Then Daniel answered with a sentence that made my chest go cold. Exactly. That is the problem. I stood there frozen in the dark while the refrigerator hummed below me and realized whatever they were planning had already gone much further than I thought. After hearing that conversation in the kitchen, I stopped sleeping normally. You start noticing things when trust disappears inside your own home. Tiny things. Doors closing when you walk into a room. Conversations stopping mid-sentence. Emily suddenly asking questions she never cared about before. Dad, where do you keep your retirement paperwork? Dad, have you updated your will recently? Dad, what happens to the company if something unexpected happens? She always tried to sound casual, but I could hear Daniel's words hiding behind hers. One Saturday morning, I came back from the hardware store and found Daniel sitting in my office chair. My office. He spun around too fast when he saw me standing in the doorway. Just looking for a pen, he said. There were folders spread across my desk. Property tax records. Insurance forms. Copies of bank statements. I stared at him for a second and asked, Why are you in here? He smiled like I was overreacting. Relax, Frank. We are family. That word started sounding uglier every time he said it. Later that afternoon, I overheard Patricia talking to Emily in the laundry room. Patricia said quietly, Your father has been forgetting things lately. Emily answered, Daniel noticed that too. I nearly walked in right then, but something stopped me. Maybe pride. Maybe fear. Because I had not forgotten a single thing. Not one appointment. Not one bill. Not one conversation. But suddenly there was this quiet little story spreading through the family that old Frank Whitmore was getting confused. And once people start believing that about you, they stop listening when you defend yourself. A few days later, my younger brother Harold drove over from Knoxville to visit. We had coffee on the porch while Daniel grilled burgers outside, acting like the perfect son-in-law. Harold eventually leaned closer and asked me, Everything okay around here? I said, Why would you ask that? He hesitated before answering. Emily called Linda last week. She said you have been struggling mentally since retirement. I honestly thought I misheard him. She said what? Harold looked uncomfortable immediately. Frank, I figured you knew. That was the moment something cracked inside me. Not anger. Something sadder than anger. Because it is one thing for strangers to think you are weak. It is another thing entirely when your own daughter starts helping people believe it. That night at dinner, Daniel kept pouring everybody wine like he owned the place. He told stories, made jokes, played the charming family man routine perfectly. Then he looked at me and said, Frank, did you ever call that doctor Emily recommended? I frowned. What doctor? Emily avoided my eyes. Daniel kept smiling. For the memory evaluation. The table got quiet. Patricia immediately said, Daniel, but he raised his hands innocently. What? We are all worried about him. Worried. Such a polite word for what they were really doing. I looked at Emily and asked, You think I need memory testing? She finally looked up at me and softly said, Dad, sometimes you seem different lately. I actually laughed when she said it. Not because it was funny. Because I suddenly understood the trap. Every reaction I had only helped their story. If I got angry, I looked unstable. If I defended myself too strongly, I sounded paranoid. Daniel sat there watching me carefully the whole time like he was measuring something. Then he casually added, Nobody is trying to take anything from you, Frank. We just want to make sure everything is protected before things get worse. Before things get worse. I remember staring down at my untouched food while my heartbeat thudded in my ears. Because in that moment, I realized they were not just questioning my memory anymore. They were building a case. And the terrifying part was, everybody around me was slowly starting to believe it. After that dinner conversation, the whole atmosphere inside the house changed. Nobody argued openly with me anymore. Honestly, I think that was worse. They started treating me gently. Too gently. Emily began repeating herself when she talked to me like I was hard of hearing. Patricia started leaving sticky notes around the kitchen reminding me about things I had already done. Doctor appointment Thursday. Medication after breakfast. Do not forget Richard Hale meeting. At first I thought maybe she was just nervous because of what Daniel had been saying. But then I found out something that made my stomach turn. One afternoon, I walked past the guest house and heard Daniel talking on the phone through the open window. He said, "We are trying to avoid court if possible. Emily thinks we can still convince him voluntarily." I stopped walking immediately. Then he lowered his voice and added, "If not, we may need documentation from a physician." I quietly stepped away before he saw me. That night I sat in my truck parked outside Lake Julian for nearly an hour staring at my phone trying to decide whether to call Emily or not. Finally I did. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. "Hey Dad," I asked her directly. "Are you trying to declare me incompetent?" Silence. Not confusion. Not outrage. Silence. Then she quietly said, "Dad, nobody wants to hurt you." Hurt me. That told me everything. I asked her, "Why are you doing this?" Her voice cracked a little when she answered, "You do not understand how stressed things have been." I almost laughed. "So your solution is taking my life away from me?" She got defensive immediately. "Nobody is taking anything away." "Then why are lawyers involved?" Another silence. Then she whispered, "Daniel is just trying to protect our future." Our future. Not yours. Not mine. Theirs. I hung up after that because I honestly did not trust myself to keep talking calmly. The next morning I tried one more time. I wrote Emily a letter by hand at the kitchen table while everybody else was asleep. 3 full pages. I reminded her about fishing at Lake Lure when she was 12, about teaching her to drive in my old Ford truck, about the nights I worked 16-hour shifts so she could go to college without debt. I wrote, "Emily, if I did something to make you stop trusting me, please tell me. But do not let somebody turn us into strangers while I am still alive." I left the letter outside her bedroom door. That evening I found it unopened on the counter beside the coffee maker. Daniel looked at it, then looked at me, and casually said, "Emotional manipulation is not going to help your case, Frank." Your case. Like I was already standing in some courtroom defending my own mind. A few days later I noticed something else. My calls started going unanswered. My nephew Tyler never returned my voicemail. Harold suddenly stopped picking up after years of talking every Sunday. Even Richard Hale sounded awkward during our next meeting. He finally admitted, "Emily mentioned you have been under a lot of cognitive stress lately." Cognitive stress. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt while he talked. Daniel was spreading the story everywhere. Quietly. Carefully. Making it sound compassionate instead of cruel. And the worst part was how believable it all sounded once people heard I was 74 years old. One Friday evening I walked into the living room and stopped cold. Daniel and Emily were sitting with a woman I had never seen before. Mid-50s. Gray blazer. Leather portfolio on her lap. Daniel stood up smiling immediately. "Frank, this is Susan Keller. She specializes in estate transitions for aging families." Aging families. Susan gave me this practiced little smile and said, "We are only here to discuss options that make everyone feel secure." I looked at Emily waiting for her to stop this. She could not even meet my eyes. I have never felt loneliness hit me the way it did in that moment. Not when my father died. Not when Patricia had surgery years ago. Nothing like that. Because sitting in my own living room, surrounded by people carrying my last name, I realized I was completely alone. After Susan Keller came to the house, something inside me just shut down. I stopped arguing. Stopped defending myself. There is a certain kind of exhaustion that comes when the people you love start looking at you like a problem they need to manage instead of a person they care about. The next few weeks felt strangely quiet. Daniel became overly polite around me. Emily avoided difficult conversations completely. Patricia spent most evenings watching television without really watching it. Nobody mentioned lawyers anymore, but I could feel it hanging in the air every time somebody looked at me too carefully. One morning I walked into the kitchen and realized they had moved my medication organizer onto the counter beside a handwritten checklist. Breakfast, pills, blood pressure, water intake. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I had been managing my own life since 1971. I built a company from scratch, paid off a 30-year mortgage early, raised a daughter, buried both my parents. But suddenly my family was acting like I needed supervision to survive a Tuesday morning. Patricia walked in while I was looking at the checklist and softly said, "Emily thought it might help you stay organized." I asked her quietly, "Do you believe them too?" She looked down immediately. That hurt more than any answer she could have given me. Around that same time, Richard Hale stopped calling about the Hendersonville project. At first I thought he was busy, but eventually I drove to the site myself. I found him near one of the excavation trucks talking with contractors. When he saw me, his whole expression changed. Nervous. Careful. He pulled me aside and lowered his voice. "Frank, I think maybe it is best if we pause your involvement for now." I asked him why. He hesitated before answering. "Your family expressed concerns about your health. They said stress and confusion have been getting worse lately." Confusion. That word again. I looked out at those hills for a second because I honestly could not trust myself to speak right away. Then I asked him, "Do I seem confused to you?" Richard looked embarrassed. "Honestly, no. But you know how liability works these days." Liability. Just like that, 40 years of reputation became fragile enough to erase with a few worried phone calls. I drove home slowly that evening through the Blue Ridge Parkway while rain tapped against the windshield. I remember pulling over near an overlook because I suddenly could not breathe right. Not from sickness, from grief. There is something deeply lonely about realizing your own daughter has been quietly dismantling your life while smiling at you across the dinner table. When I got home, the house was empty except for Patricia. She was folding laundry in silence. I sat across from her and finally asked the question I had been avoiding for weeks. "When did you stop trusting me?" She froze for a second, holding one of my old flannel shirts. Then she whispered, "Frank, everybody is just scared." "Of what?" She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Of losing everything if something happens to you unexpectedly." There it was. Finally. Not concern for me. Concern for what I owned. I nodded slowly after that and went upstairs without another word. That night, I sat alone in my office looking through old photo albums until almost dawn. Emily at age 6 holding a sparkler in the driveway. Emily graduating college. Emily dancing barefoot at her wedding while I pretended not to cry in front of the guests. I realized every memory in those albums came from a version of my family that no longer existed. Sometime around 4 in the morning, I opened the safe again and carefully removed a thin brown envelope from the back corner behind the trust documents. I had not touched it in almost 11 years. On the front, written in black ink, were 6 words that suddenly mattered more than ever before. In the event of my incapacity, and for the first time in months, I felt something besides heartbreak. Inside that brown envelope were documents I had prepared years earlier after watching one of my closest friends lose control of his company during a family dispute. Durable power of attorney instructions, corporate protection clauses, independent medical review requirements. Most importantly, a signed agreement placing temporary authority of Whitmore Holdings into the hands of an outside trustee if anyone ever attempted to challenge my competency. Without verified medical evidence from 2 separate neurologists. Back then it had felt excessive. Paranoid, even. Sitting alone in my office at 4 in the morning, it suddenly felt like the smartest decision I had ever made. The next week I stopped reacting emotionally to anything inside the house. That surprised Daniel more than anger ever could have. He would throw little comments at me during breakfast, and I would simply sip my coffee. Emily would ask careful questions about my memory, and I would answer calmly. Patricia kept watching me like she was waiting for some kind of breakdown that never came. Meanwhile, I quietly started rebuilding parts of my life outside that house. Every morning at 6:30, I drove to Hendersonville anyway. Richard had pulled me from the official project, but there was nothing stopping me from visiting old contacts. Construction people talk. Always have. Within 2 weeks, I was having breakfast meetings at diners with former subcontractors, site managers, and suppliers I had known for decades. One morning, an old electrician named Carl Jensen shook my hand across a booth at a Waffle House and said, "Frank, I do not care what people are saying. Half these boys running projects today still use systems you designed 20 years ago." I had not heard respect in somebody's voice for a long time. Another contractor asked me if I would consult privately on a mountain property near Boone. Then another one called about a hotel renovation in Knoxville. Nothing huge, just advice, planning, budget oversight. But slowly, something started waking back up inside me. I bought a new leather notebook and started carrying it everywhere. I cleaned out my old workshop for the first time in years. Some nights I stayed out there until midnight drawing floor plans under the yellow light above my workbench while classic rock played softly on the radio. Daniel noticed the change almost immediately. One evening he stopped me near the garage and asked, "You have been gone a lot lately." I shrugged. "Keeping busy." He narrowed his eyes slightly. "With what exactly?" "Work." He laughed under his breath like he did not believe me. "Frank, nobody is hiring. 74-year-old consultants." I looked at him and calmly answered, "Funny. They keep calling anyway." He did not smile after that. Around the same time, I quietly met with an attorney in downtown Asheville named Margaret Ellis. Margaret had handled corporate litigation for Whitmore Holdings years ago. The second she heard what was happening, her expression changed completely. She asked, "Have you signed anything recently?" "No, good. Do not." Then she reviewed the documents from the brown envelope and slowly nodded. "Frank, if they are attempting to pressure you into a competency declaration without cause, they are going to have a serious problem." Hearing somebody say that out loud nearly brought me to tears right there in her office. Not because I was scared anymore, because for the first time in months, somebody believed me. A few days later, I came home and found Daniel standing in the kitchen holding one of my business cards from Margaret Ellis's law office. He turned it over slowly between his fingers and said, "Why are you talking to corporate attorneys?" I set my keys down carefully and answered, "Why are you searching through my things?" We stared at each other for a long second. Then he smiled again, but this time the confidence looked thinner somehow. "You know," he said quietly, "families usually handle things like this together." I nodded slowly. Healthy families do. That night, for the first time in almost a year, I slept peacefully. And the next morning, I woke up to 3 missed calls from numbers connected to projects worth more money than Daniel had probably ever seen in his life. Over the next 2 months, my life slowly started looking familiar again. Not the family part. That stayed cold and tense inside the house. But outside those walls, people still remembered who Frank Whitmore used to be. More importantly, they remembered what I could do. Richard Hale eventually called me back personally one Friday morning while I was sanding a cedar tabletop in my workshop. He said, "Frank, I made a mistake pulling you off that Hendersonville project." I kept sanding for a second before answering. "What changed?" He laughed quietly. "The young project manager they replaced you with nearly buried us in permit violations." I could not help smiling a little at that. Then Richard said something I had not heard in years. "I need you back leading this." Leading. Not assisting. Not advising. Leading. The following Monday, I drove up to the site before sunrise wearing my old tan field jacket with the Whitmore Holdings logo stitched above the chest pocket. I had not worn that jacket in almost 5 years. The second I stepped out of the truck, a few of the older contractors recognized me immediately. One guy yelled, "Well, I will be damned. Frank Whitmore is back." Another one walked over grinning and said, "Guess this project might actually survive now." That morning I spent 4 hours reviewing site plans, correcting drainage layouts, and reorganizing subcontractor schedules that had already fallen behind. It felt natural, familiar, like breathing after being underwater too long. Around lunchtime, a young foreman handed me a hard hat with a fresh white sticker across the front. Site director. I stared at it longer than I probably should have. Silly thing to get emotional over, I know. But after months of being treated like a confused old man who could barely manage his medication, seeing those words printed in black letters did something to me. It reminded me that my life had not disappeared just because my family stopped respecting it. By the end of that week, I had 3 active consulting contracts and more calls coming in than I could answer myself. Margaret Ellis helped me formally restructure portions of Whitmore Holdings so no unauthorized family claims could touch the company assets without independent review. Quietly, legally, thoroughly. Meanwhile, Daniel started acting nervous in ways he could not completely hide anymore. One evening, I walked into the kitchen wearing my field jacket after returning from Hendersonville, and he looked at the logo on my chest like it personally offended him. "You are still doing all this construction stuff?" he asked. I opened the refrigerator calmly and said, "Apparently people still trust my judgment." He forced a laugh. "At your age, that sounds exhausting." Before I could answer, Patricia quietly spoke from the dining room table. "Frank looks happier lately." The room went silent after she said that because it was true. I was happier. Not because my family situation improved. It had not. Emily barely spoke to me unless necessary. Daniel watched me constantly now, but for the first time in months, I no longer felt helpless inside my own life. One afternoon, my grandson, Mason, wandered into my workshop while I was reviewing blueprints. He looked at the drafting table and asked, "Mom said you used to build hotels and stuff. Is that true?" I smiled and handed him an old photograph from 1998 showing me standing beside a completed resort project in Gatlinburg. Mason stared at it for a second and quietly said, "You look important." I almost laughed at the honesty of it. Kids notice things adults pretend not to see. Then he asked, "Why does Dad act like you cannot do anything?" That question stayed with me long after he left the workshop. Because deep down, I think everybody in that house had started realizing the same thing at once. Their version of weak, old Frank Whitmore was beginning to crack apart. And the closer I got to rebuilding my life outside that family, the more dangerous the situation inside that house was becoming. Which finally brings me back to the dinner where everything exploded. The dinner happened on a cold Thursday night in late October. I remember the weather because rain kept tapping softly against the windows while Patricia lit those little vanilla candles she always used when company came over. Emily had spent all afternoon cooking pot roast, green beans, and mashed potatoes. On the surface, it looked like a normal family dinner. But the second I walked into that dining room, I could feel something waiting underneath all the smiles. Daniel was already seated at the head of the table when I came downstairs wearing my field jacket from Hendersonville. He glanced at the logo on my chest and said, "Still playing construction, boss?" I pulled my chair out slowly and answered, "Still getting paid for it too." My grandson, Mason, almost smiled at that before Emily shot him a look. Nobody spoke for a few seconds after that. Patricia tried to soften the mood by asking about the weather up in Hendersonville, but Daniel kept steering the conversation back toward business. "You know," he said while pouring himself another glass of wine, "Emily and I have been talking a lot lately about simplifying things around here." I kept eating quietly. He continued, "At some point, somebody has to think long-term." I looked up and asked, "Long-term for who?" Daniel smiled like he had been waiting for that question. Then he reached beside his chair and pulled out a thick folder. White papers, tabs, signatures, legal language. Emily immediately looked nervous. Patricia stopped eating altogether. Daniel slid the folder across the table toward me and calmly said, "These are updated transition documents Margaret should have helped you prepare years ago." The second he said Margaret's name, I realized he had somehow learned about my attorney meetings. He tapped the top page with one finger. This would transfer operational control of Whitmore Holdings into a family trust structure. Cleaner, safer, more modern. I stared at the papers without touching them. Then I asked quietly, "And who controls this trust?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Emily and I would oversee things jointly, obviously. Obviously. Like stealing my company was just basic family planning." Emily finally spoke up softly. "Dad, maybe just look through it first." I turned toward her slowly. "Did you know about this?" She swallowed hard before answering. "Daniel worked really hard on it." That was not an answer. Daniel jumped in immediately. "Frank, nobody is trying to hurt you here." Then he gave this fake patient sigh people use with difficult children. "But we all see what is happening." I could feel the room tightening around me. Even the sound of silverware stopped. I asked him carefully, "What exactly is happening?" Daniel folded his hands together and said, "Your memory issues are becoming impossible to ignore." There it was, finally spoken out loud in front of everybody. Patricia looked down at her plate. Emily looked like she wanted to disappear. Mason stared between all of us without understanding what was really happening. I felt strangely calm, more calm than I should have been. Maybe because deep down I already knew this dinner had never been about concern. It was an ambush. Daniel pushed the papers closer toward me and said, "You can make this easy tonight, Frank." I looked at the signature line near the bottom of the first page. Then I noticed something else. The witness section was already partially filled out. Dates included, meaning they expected me to sign before I ever sat down at that table. I slowly placed my fork beside my plate and asked one final question. "And what happens if I refuse?" Nobody answered right away. The rain kept hitting the windows softly while Daniel stared at me with that thin little smile on his face. Then he reached for his wine glass, leaned back in his chair, and quietly said, "That would be a mistake." I looked at Daniel for a long moment after he said that. Nobody at the table moved. The candles flickered softly beside the mashed potatoes while rain rolled down the windows behind him. Then I reached forward, closed the folder slowly, and slid it back across the table without signing a single page. Daniel's smile disappeared a little. "Frank," he said carefully, "you really should think this through." I nodded once. "I already have." He leaned back in his chair and let out this small laugh like he was embarrassed for me. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." Emily finally spoke quietly. "Dad, maybe we can revisit this after the holidays." I turned toward her and asked, "How long have you been planning this?" She froze completely. Daniel answered for her. "This is not some conspiracy." I looked at him calmly. "Then why were the witness signatures already prepared before I sat down tonight?" Nobody answered. Even Patricia looked surprised by that. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he recovered fast. "That was just efficiency." "No," I said quietly. "That was expectation." The room went still again. I picked up my water glass slowly, took a sip, then set it back down. "You already decided I was incapable before I ever defended myself." Daniel folded his arms. "Frank, you have been forgetting things." I looked directly at him and asked, "Like what?" He opened his mouth, then stopped. Because there was nothing. Not one actual example. Just rumors. Impressions. Suggestions repeated enough times to start sounding real. Emily looked shaken now. I could see it in her face. Like part of her suddenly realized how far this had gone. Daniel noticed too, and his tone changed immediately. Softer. More manipulative. "Emily, your father is confused right now. This is exactly what I was worried about." That sentence did it. Not the paperwork. Not the lies. That sentence. Because I finally understood something sitting there at that table. Daniel genuinely believed I was cornered. He believed age had made me powerless. He believed the quiet old man in front of him had no moves left. I reached inside my field jacket slowly and placed a sealed envelope on the table between us. Margaret Ellis had prepared it 3 days earlier. Daniel frowned immediately. "What is this?" "Open it." He looked irritated now more than confident. But he opened it anyway. I watched his expression change line by line as he read. First confusion, then disbelief, then fear. Real fear. Emily leaned closer. "Daniel, what is it?" He did not answer right away. So I answered for him. "Those are the legal protections attached to Whitmore Holdings in the event somebody attempts a fraudulent competency action against me." Patricia looked up sharply. Daniel finally snapped. "You had lawyers preparing against your own family?" I kept my voice calm. "No. I had lawyers preparing against anyone who tried to steal from me." Nobody spoke after that. Daniel flipped through the pages faster now, his face getting paler the longer he read. Independent medical review requirements. Fraud liability clauses. Automatic financial audits triggered by coercion attempts. Then he reached the final page and stopped breathing for a second. Emily whispered, "Daniel?" He looked up at me slowly. "You transferred control authority?" I nodded once. "Months ago." Patricia stared at me in shock. "To who?" I answered quietly, "An outside trustee board." Daniel shoved his chair back hard enough to rattle the silverware. "You had no right to do that without discussing it with the family." I almost smiled at that. Interesting thing to say after trying to take my company without telling me. Emily covered her mouth with one hand. She finally understood. Every meeting, every phone call, every rumor they spread about my mind. I had seen all of it coming long before this dinner. Daniel looked down at the paperwork again, like he was searching for some way out buried in the legal language. Then his eyes stopped on one particular paragraph, and for the first time since I met him, I saw a genuine panic break through his composure. Because hidden inside that agreement was something he never expected me to know. Daniel kept staring at that final paragraph like the words might somehow rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. Emily leaned toward him nervously and whispered, "What does it say?" He finally answered without taking his eyes off the paper. "There is an active financial investigation clause." I nodded once. "Correct." Patricia looked confused. "What investigation?" Daniel immediately snapped. "Nothing." Too fast. Too sharp. The whole room felt different after that. Like the air itself had changed sides. I folded my hands together calmly and said, 3 months ago, someone attempted to access protected business accounts connected to Whitmore Holdings using copied authorization documents. Emily's face drained of color instantly. Daniel finally looked up at me. "You are accusing me now?" I kept my voice level. "I am stating facts." He pushed the paperwork away from himself. "This is insane." I almost laughed at that word. Insane. After months of hearing whispers about my memory, my stability, my confusion, now suddenly I was too sharp for his comfort. Emily looked between us anxiously. Daniel, tell me you did not. He cut her off immediately. I was trying to protect us. Us again. Always us. Never her. Never family. Never love. Just control wrapped inside panic. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed another document on the table. Bank timestamps. Security notifications. Access attempts traced through a private network tied to Daniel's consulting company. Margaret had gathered everything quietly over weeks. Daniel looked at the papers for maybe 2 seconds before leaning back heavily in his chair. For the first time since I met him, he looked small. Patricia covered her mouth softly. Oh my God. Emily stared at her husband like she did not recognize him anymore. Daniel, did you try to access Dad's accounts? He rubbed both hands over his face and muttered. It was not like that. I asked calmly, then what was it like? He looked at me with anger finally breaking through the fear. You were sitting on millions while your family struggled. There it was. The truth. Not concern for my health. Not fear for my future. Resentment. He thought my success belonged to him simply because he married my daughter. Emily looked horrified now. You told me this was about protecting the company. Daniel stood up suddenly. Because somebody had to think about the future. I stayed seated. My future was never your property. Nobody spoke after that. Rain still tapped softly against the windows while the candles burned lower across the table. Mason quietly excused himself upstairs because even he could feel something breaking apart inside that room. Emily finally started crying softly into her hands. Dad, I did not know about the account access. I believed her. That was the tragic part. Daniel manipulated everybody differently. Patricia through fear. Emily through pressure and guilt. The rest of the family through rumors about my mind. But sitting there looking at my daughter cry, I also understood something else. She still chose to believe him over me for months. That damage does not disappear in one conversation. Daniel grabbed his truck keys from the counter and pointed at me angrily. You turned your own family into enemies. I answered quietly, no. You did that the moment you confused kindness with weakness. He stared at me for another second like he wanted to argue more, but there was nothing left to say. He walked out into the rain without another word. Emily started to follow him, then stopped halfway to the door. She turned back toward me with tears running down her face and whispered, Dad, I am sorry. I looked at her for a long time before answering. I know, but forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. That was the part she had not understood yet. Later that night, after everybody went upstairs, I sat alone at the dining room table staring at the cold food nobody touched anymore. Patricia quietly walked back into the room and stood beside me for a moment before asking, what happens now? I looked toward the dark hallway where family photographs still hung on the walls from years when all of us were happy together. Then I answered honestly, I do not think any of us know yet. Daniel moved out 3 days after that dinner. Not dramatically. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just quiet footsteps early in the morning and the sound of his truck pulling away before sunrise while fog still covered the mountains outside Asheville. Emily stayed for another month in the guest house with Mason while they figured out what came next. We barely spoke at first. Some wounds are too fresh for conversation. But little by little, things changed. One Saturday morning I walked outside and found Emily sitting alone on the back porch holding an old photo album from the workshop years. She looked exhausted. Older somehow. She quietly asked, Dad, when did you stop trusting me? I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Probably around the same time you stopped asking me who I really was. She cried after that. Not loudly. Just silently staring down at those old photographs while the wind moved through the trees around us. The truth is, healing does not happen in one conversation. Sometimes it starts with people finally becoming honest enough to sit inside the damage they created. Daniel eventually became the subject of multiple financial reviews tied to several business deals outside our family. I did not celebrate that. Honestly, by that point, I was too tired to enjoy revenge. There is a difference between winning and finally protecting your peace. I learned that the hard way. As for Whitmore Holdings, I never sold it. Instead, I restructured the company completely and created mentorship programs for younger contractors across Western North Carolina. Every month now, I meet apprentices barely older than my grandson and teach them the things nobody teaches anymore. Patience, integrity, How reputation matters more than shortcuts. Funny enough, the older I got, the more valuable those lessons became. Patricia and I eventually separated quietly. No courtroom battles. No bitterness. Just two people admitting they had spent too many years confusing silence with love. I do not hate her. I do not even hate Emily. Pain becomes lighter once you stop carrying it like a weapon. These days my life is smaller than it used to be, but somehow fuller too. I still wake up before sunrise. I still drink coffee on the porch while the mountains turn blue in the morning light. Mason visits almost every weekend now. Last month, he helped me rebuild an old cedar bench behind the workshop. Halfway through sanding the wood, he looked at me and asked, "Grandpa, how did you stay so calm when everybody doubted you?" I smiled a little and told him the truth. Because I learned a long time ago that people can only define your worth if you hand it to them. That might be the biggest lesson this whole experience taught me. Sometimes the people closest to you slowly stop seeing your humanity and start seeing only your usefulness. Your money, your house, your sacrifices, your silence. And when that happens, you have to remember something important. Love without respect eventually turns into control. If you are listening to this right now while feeling trapped inside your own family pain, please hear me carefully. Protect your heart, but also protect your name, your finances, your boundaries, and your peace. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. God gave us intuition for a reason. Too many good people ignore warning signs because they are afraid of looking suspicious or unkind. But kindness without boundaries becomes permission for people to destroy you quietly. And no matter your age, no matter what people say about you, your life still has value beyond what others can gain from it. I believe that now more than ever. My name is Frank Whitmore. I am 74 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let loneliness convince you to surrender your dignity just to keep people comfortable. Tonight, the old field jacket with the Whitmore Holdings patch still hangs beside the workshop door. Some mornings I catch myself looking at it while the coffee brews and remembering the man I thought I had lost somewhere along the way. Turns out he was still there the whole time. He just needed to stop apologizing for surviving. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Truly, if any part of it touched your heart, I hope it reminded you that you are not weak for feeling hurt, and you are not selfish for protecting yourself. Leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. And if stories like this help you feel a little less alone in this world, you are always welcome here. There are more stories coming soon about family, betrayal, second chances, and the quiet strength people discover after life breaks them open. Some of those stories are even harder than this one. And if you stay for the next video, you might hear another moment that changes the way you see forgiveness forever.